Hey, what's up everyone? This video is thanks to Christopher Vassos, who recommended that I do a video on unpopular lands. As a reminder, I respond to every comment, and on each video, I will pin a comment after 4 days, deciding what video topic I will post about. So if you have any unpopular topics that you would like a video on, let us know in the comments below, and you will definitely get a response, and you might just get pinned. So yeah, as the comment mentions, today we're covering unpopular lands, which is a category that can apply to most decks. But today, all of the cards that I will be sharing are under 1% of decks played, and will touch utility and mana lands. And so yeah, they won't be as good as a lot of the lands that you're playing. But if you're on a budget, or if you're looking for just something unique that you don't see every day, then you've come to the right place. Our first card today is Flamekin Village, which is played in 21,500 decks, or 0.72% of decks that can play it. Flamekin Village says, as this land enters, you may reveal an elemental card from your hand. If you don't, this land enters tapped. You can then tap it for 1 red, or you can pay 1 red and tap it to give target creature haste until end of turn. I don't think the elemental aspect is very applicable, at least not in my decks, but I would slot this in as one of the lands I expect to come in to play tapped. I like the ability. I think haste is one of the strongest keywords that you can give to a creature, because most busted creatures don't have haste, which acts as a limitation, but being able to slap it on any creature with a strong attack or an on damage effect can just swing the momentum of games by not giving your opponents the chance to untap and respond to it before your next turn comes around. I also like that this land can act as a politics tool to give your opponent's creature haste if it comes to that, or if you need to strike a deal with someone. Next up is Ominous Cemetery, which sees play in 18,997 decks, or 0.34% of decks that can play it. Moving forward, it's safe to assume that every deck is now in a very low percentage of decks, less than 1% like I mentioned, so I won't be mentioning the percentage anymore. This land taps for a colorless mana, and you can also pay 5 and tap it to exile this land, and target creature's owner shuffles it into their library. Pretty straightforward ability, and it can be a convenient one to have access to in the late game. If you're struggling with eating your veggies when it comes to your deck building, and maybe slotting in enough removal spells because you need, let's say, another draw spell instead, you could slot this in for one of your lands, and this acts as the removal that you need while also being able to play the extra draw spell that you want. So it's not very often that you have a land that can slot in for one of your removal options. It's kind of a high activation cost, 5 is a lot, but it can be a good mana sink in the late game, and tucking a creature into a shuffled library is second to exile in terms of, it's very unlikely that you'll be seeing that creature again. And this is an ability that can come in handy in almost every game. It's pretty applicable. There's always a creature that could be exiled, or shuffled if you need to, and it's instant speed, so that is also a good option for removal. Our third land today is Sunken Palace, which is in 18,492 decks. This comes into play tapped and taps for 1 blue. You can also tap it for 1 generic and 1 blue to exile 7 cards from your graveyard. Add 1 blue. When you spend this mana to cast a spell or activate an ability, copy that spell or ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. Mana abilities can't be copied. Okay, I love this. If you're not familiar with my channel, copying spells is one of my favorite things in the game. I just think, most spells aren't made with the intention of being copied, so doubling up on it can just be incredibly powerful. I think also one of the craziest parts about this card is that it is repeatable. You don't sacrifice or exile this land. you exile cards from your graveyard instead. It's essentially like a delve for a copy ability, which so many decks can easily do. Other than, costing 7 cards in your graveyard, this is pretty much 1 mana and tapping because it does refund you 1 of the blue. It's also a cave card, which, similar to deserts and gates, is a non-basic land type that does have quite a bit of support if that's something that you've already built into your deck. Also, it's becoming a lot more common to have cards that have benefits when a card leaves your graveyard. So this is a land that could activate or trigger a lot of those abilities of a card leaving your graveyard. I wasn't aware of this card until recently, so I'll be buying this card and slotting it into several of my decks. I've been looking into making a clone deck, so this will be going in it, to copy fun creatures that are good enough to be cloned. But speaking of that, does anyone have any recommendations I should look into when it comes to like fun clone decks and fun clone commanders? I'd love to see what recommendations you have in mind. Speaking of these like clones decks, up next we have Ljara Mirror Lake, which is in 18,490 decks. This card also enters tapped and taps for blue. For 2 generic, 2 green, and 1 blue, you can tap it. The ability says, sacrifice this land. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Activate only as a sorcery. So, yeah, this could fit into a clones deck for sure. The coming in tapped is a bummer, but this does produce blue. So, aside from the 1 turn with access to less mana, this gives access to a pretty good ability if you have a super strong creature on board, or run, non-legendary creatures that can be copied. Or maybe, you're running a multicolored deck and run creatures like Kokoshu, the Evening Star, who wants to die. This land can be a great option for creating those clones that get sacrificed to the legend rule. We're going back to a colorless option again with Fyrexias Core, which is in 18,435 decks. This taps for colorless, or you can pay 1 to tap it and sacrifice an artifact to gain 1 life. This is super basic ability, but I included it because there are several decks that play artifacts that want those artifacts to be recurred, but sometimes the engine isn't in place to actually sacrifice the artifact to then recur from the graveyard. Take something like Ichor Wellspring or Prize Statue that has a benefit from entering or leaving, but doesn't really have anything else other than those ETB and LTB effects. Some commanders using this are Osgir the Reconstructor, Daretti Scrap Savant, Gandalf the White, and Emery Lurker in the Lock. The ability can be activated at any time, and if you are a deck playing and recurring a lot of artifacts, you really don't mind that this taps for colorless, because that colorless can help you to cast a lot of the artifacts that you're planning to play anyways. Next up is Bad River, which is in 18,255 decks, and part of what I call the fetch lands at home cycle. These are budget fetch lands that come into play tapped. If you're not familiar with these, the rest of the cycle is Floodplain, Grasslands, Mountain Valley, and Rocky Tar Pit. Like most fetch lands, these are nice because they can tutor non-basic lands like Surveil lands or Triomes, but I'm not going to lie, if your goal is to tutor a Surveil land or a Triome, it can feel pretty bad having 2 turns in a row of tapped lands coming into play. But what is pretty nice about this, that after it does untap, these can be helpful because you can wait to crack it. Like if somebody plays, if they play something and you need the island in order to respond to it, you can crack it to get an island into play untapped to cast your counterspell. Or if you don't need it, then you can just wait until the end step before your turn and then crack it and get that Triome or that Surveil land. Straightforward ability, and it's an option for people who don't own or don't want to proxy the expensive fetch lands. I wanted to take a second to call out the Unpopular MTG Patreon. If you're enjoying these cards and want to be a part of a community sharing their magic hidden gems every day, then you can join the Patreon Discord through the link below. We'll also be running a poll later today in the Discord about what the next competition deck topic should be. I personally think that this next one is pretty fun. It's Endless Sands, which is in 17,881 decks. This is a desert that taps for colorless. You can pay 2 to tap it and exile a creature you control, or you can pay 4, tap it, and sacrifice it to return each creature card exiled with it to the battlefield under its owner's control. I don't run any desert decks, but many deserts are known to sacrifice themselves for an ability, and they can often be recurred from the graveyard. This is an interesting option for blink decks that want to store up their effects, or also if you have a board wipe in hand. You can start preparing for it 1 or 2 turns in advance by exiling your creatures to save them before you cast the big board wipe, then bring them back either this turn or the next turn. This is like a super unique ability for a land. The only other one that I know of is Safe Haven, but I didn't include Safe Haven on this list because it doesn't tap for mana. Its only ability is focused on creating a literal safe haven for your creatures to either tuck away for some reason, like a board wipe. But let me know, is there any other land that has this kind of safe protection ability? Our next card is actually a cycle of cards that I have used pretty often in my monocolored or even 2-colored decks. The Autonomous Furnace sees play in 15,251 decks. This comes into play tapped, adds 1 red, and you can pay 1 generic and 1 red, then sacrifice it to draw a card. It's not ideal to be in a situation where you need this, but I've used it before when I have, a few cards in hand and I need an answer. I play these cards pretty often in Arena, actually, and I've become so used to having some sort of land that has like a mana sink ability that when I'm in a predicament and I have a bunch of lands but nothing to spend that mana on, I find myself wanting this card a lot more often than I actually am playing it. That and also the Hidden Cycle, the lands that discover for 4, but those were just barely too popular to discuss in this video. Like I said, in an ideal game, you don't need to use these, but I like the option it provides if it ever comes to it. The other cards to complete this cycle are the Dross Pits, the Fair Basilica, the Surgical Bay, and the Hunter Maze. Anyone else like these cards? Or am I all alone on an unpopular island? I mean, I don't blame you if you don't want to join, lol. Up next is our first Wooburg land of the day, which is Grand Coliseum, played in 14,652 decks. This card also comes into play tapped. I think we're seeing a theme for all of these cards and these lands that most people aren't playing. This card comes into play tap. You can tap it for 1 generic, or you can add 1 mana of any color at the price of it dealing 1 damage to you, which is nothing in Commander. There are so many great lands that come into play tapped, like Triomes. Granted, those are fetchable, but this gives 5 mana and isn't like some of the other very budget Wooburg lands that requires you to pay 1 or sacrifice another land when it enters. Aside from 5-color commanders, this can also go into decks that care about being dealt damage, like Darien King of Keldor, to create a soldier token, or Anti-Blight Bad Influence, which will put a +1/+1 counter on it. This will also add 1 mana and reduce 1 mana in a Rowan Sign of War deck, but I can't really think of others. Are there any other commanders that come to mind that benefit from being dealt damage by a source you control? Next, we have Ghost Town, which is played in 13,880 decks. This land taps for colorless, and you can pay 0 to return it to your hand, but it can only be activated only if it's not your turn. The primary use case that I can see this for is if you want to guarantee that you'll have a landfall trigger the next turn. There's literally so many strong landfall decks and creatures these days, so if you don't have a land in your hand, you could return this to your hand for free on someone else's turn to make sure that you hit that land drop in your next turn. Or if you're playing a commander that lets you play more than one land on each of your turns, you could return this to your hand when you have already one in hand, so you guarantee that you'll hit 2 land drops and 2 landfall triggers and, double up the number of counters on your Scythe Cub, or something like that. It doesn't come into play tapped, so if you are playing landfall decks, I think, this acts as a pretty good insurance card to make sure that you hit those triggers every single turn. Now we have Blighted Step, which is in 11,114 decks. This land taps for 1 colorless, or you can pay 3 white and 1 generic to tap it and sacrifice it to gain 2 life for each creature you control. I like this ability a lot. I think 2 for each creature that you control can be a huge life total swing in go wide decks, and it can be, a nice little lifeline if someone wants to swing at you for lethal, but you have the mana open to fake interaction or crack this ability. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this card gets on more people's radars as it starts to see more play in Hope decks now that Final Fantasy is out, which, is a land option to get that life trigger for the commander. Next up, we have Winding Canyons, which is in 11,052 decks. This also taps for colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it. Until end of turn, you may play creature cards whenever you could play instants. This card is nice because the ability doesn't sacrifice the land, so you could use this every turn cycle if you play more, of a control style deck to cast a creature on an opponent's end step if you didn't end up casting your control spells or interaction. I'm also just a huge fan of Flash in general because it makes open mana so much more daunting. If you have all your mana open, people are less likely to attack you if they see that you have an ability to give creatures or cards flash, because they have no idea what's in your hand. So if they attack you, you could just flash in a big creature and kill their attackers. Or maybe you just want to wait right before your turn. If you've already established a board that you're worried could get wiped by sorcery speed board wipes, you could just wait and then cast this right before your turn starts to make sure that the creature survives before your next turn. You'll notice that a lot of these cards have a theme that they tap for colorless, but the effects that many of them have are extremely underrated in my opinion. Next up, we have Nubanolia, which is in 10,541 decks. This comes into play tapped and scries 1 when it enters. It also taps for 1 white. So if you play the temples in your dual color decks, then this can be, and include in your mono white decks. I actually believe that this is the only land in its cycle that taps for 1 color, which I thought was pretty interesting because aside from the 2-colored temple cycle, there's also some lands that tap for colorless and scry 1, but there isn't an equivalent that taps for mono blue, black, red, or green that also scries 1. I like the temples, so this is something I'll likely slot more often into my mono white decks. The next one has quite a bit of text. It's Bredagard Stronghold, which is in 9,570 decks. This comes into play tapped and taps for green. You can also pay 1 green, 2 white, and tap it to sacrifice it and put a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 target creatures you control. They gain vigilance and lifelink until end of turn, and it can only be activated as a sorcery. So if you're in a deck with access to Selesnya colors, this can be a nice little combat support land. Green creatures don't get vigilance very often, and they also don't get lifelink very often either. So this could make a Galta a 13/13 attacker that gives you 13 life for attacking, and it doesn't even tap, so it will deter attackers until your next turn too. It's a total of 4 mana to activate because you're sacrificing this land, but this is a powerful ability, and I'm honestly surprised it doesn't see more play. Maybe because, who knows, like Selesnya usually goes wide instead of tall, so people don't think it's that strong. Let me know what you think. Now we have Unidake the Cloudkeeper, which is in 8,928 decks. This comes into play tapped, then you can pay 2 life to add 2 mana to your mana pool, but this can only be spent to play legendary spells. Yeah, pretty straightforward. This is a very niche land option for maybe your Legends decks or your Super Friends decks. I think this card has a lot of things going against it. You know, it comes into play tapped, and it only adds colorless mana, and you have to pay life. So you need a pretty good justification to decide to slot this one in. Maybe you play a commander that never stays on the board, so this will help to pay the commander tax. Or maybe you actually do play enough legendary spells that you're willing to take the risk in slotting this into your deck. What do you think? Like, are there any decks that you play this in? It's definitely one of the higher risk options on the list today. And I personally probably wouldn't play it, but that's because I don't have a deck that I see fit for it. Now that we're sub 10,000 decks, we're closer to 0% of decks that are playing these lands instead of 1%. So people really do not like these lands that I'm about to mention. We now have Miridans Core, which is played in 7,651 decks. This can tap to add 1 colorless, or it can tap to put a charge counter on it, or it can tap to remove a charge counter to add a mana of any color. So as with any charge counter card, this goes well in proliferate decks, so you only need to put a charge counter on it once, then you'll be able to keep stacking them to continuously tap for mana of any color. What I also like about this card is, compared to other ones that make you tap one turn to put some sort of counter on it, this does have the ability to just tap for colorless. So if you really do need access to just any mana this turn, you do have that option. You can just tap it for colorless, or you can maybe wait on other people's turns to see if you end up needing to cast a spell. And if not, then you can just tap this to add another counter on it. So you'll have 1 or 2, and then you'll be able to continue to add those on. Unsurprisingly, Atraxa is the commander playing this land the most. Now we have Riftstone Portal, which sees play in 7,436 decks. This taps for colorless, or if it's in your graveyard, lands you control have add green or white to your mana pool. This doesn't replace their other abilities, so your lands will still be able to tap for the colors they normally would produce. This just acts as a great mana fixer to turn your lands into duels if you're in Selesnya. It also comes into play untapped, but the trick is, to get it in your bin, which I think is now just easier than ever. There's so many discard effects these days. Or if you're in green, there's a lot of land sacrifice effects like Harrow, Crop Rotation, Lotus Field, or Springbloom Druid. So you can sacrifice this land to get more lands and then turn every land into a dual land. We don't have too many left. Up next is Sajiri Step, which is in 5,986 decks. This comes into play tapped, and when it does, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. It also taps to add 1 white mana. I think this ability can be extremely powerful, especially for how unpopular it is. Yes, it does come into play tapped, and it is a land, so you can only cast it, play it at sorcery speed, so you're not really giving this protection in order to save it or actually protect the creature, but rather the protection that you're giving it is most likely used to make sure that you can attack your opponents without getting blocked. So if you're in a Voltron deck, this can guarantee that your creature doesn't get blocked by a certain opponent, and it will also protect it from any removal that player might try to throw at it once they realize that you're attacking them. That is, if they are monocolored or they're playing colors that are very heavy in removal, then you could pick that color as protection. I think whether it's Voltron or you're just playing a very aggro deck that wants to turn its creatures sideways and attack your opponents, this protection clause could come in pretty handy, and I think it is worth the tap coming in because protection is usually worth 1 or 2 mana at least as well. Our next land is Sandstone Bridge, which is in 5,497 decks. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to throw in the other Battle for Zendikar lands, which all but one are unpopular. These lands come into play tapped, tap for a specific color, and have an ETB effect tagged onto it as well. So Sandstone Bridge taps for white and gives a creature +1/+1 and vigilance until end of turn. Skyline Cascade taps for blue and makes a target creature not untap during its controller's next untap step. Looming Spires taps for red and gives a creature +1/+1 and gain first strike until end of turn. Fertile Thicket is green and lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library and reveal up to 1 basic land and put that on top of your library and the rest on the bottom in any order. And our most popular celebrity of this entire video is Mortuary Mire, which taps for black and puts target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. This one is played in 143,260 decks, which is 5.5 times more than the other 4 land cards in this entire cycle combined. That's obviously, the strongest effect, but for how unloved the others are, the keywords can be pretty nice in monocolored decks, and I love effects that don't make creatures untap that, can really just mess up some decks that depend on their commander's activation ability. So I think these are pretty fun. Now we have Soaring Seacliffe, which is in 5,324 decks, and seems like it could have been a part of the Battle for Zendikar land cycle that we literally just covered. This comes into play tapped, taps for blue, and gives a creature flying when it enters. Simple ability, flying is a great one that can get creatures through if you have a deck that cares about that or that wants to get creatures to attack. Deva Excavations is played in 3,307 decks. This land says, if this land would enter, sacrifice an untapped island instead. If you do, put this land onto the battlefield. If you don't, put it into its owner's graveyard. It taps to add 1 colorless and a blue, or you can pay 1 and tap for an ability that has been errated to say scry 1. I like this card a lot. Yeah, it sacrifices an island, but it doesn't come into play tapped, so it can refund the mana that you would have had. Yeah, it is generic instead of blue, but it will be able to give you 2 mana for the rest of the game, and paying 1 to scry 1 is honestly not a terrible rate in a color that incentivizes you to store mana for interaction. Like, this is an outlet that you can pay for if you don't use the mana on other people's turns, like they didn't play something that you need to counter, so you can pay 1 to scry 1 and make sure that you have a good draw for your next turn. If you play this outside of mono blue, it can also be pretty helpful to fill the bin with lands that you can then recur from your graveyard. Next, we have City of Shadows, which is in only 2,339 decks. This is from the dark, so it is on the more expensive side, costing in the mid-20s for damaged copies. This had a much wordier text in the past, but the errated text says, tap, exile a creature you control, put a storage counter on this land, or tap, add a colorless mana for each storage counter on this land. The errata is honestly pretty nice because before it said sacrifice one of your creatures, but remove it from the game instead. So the sacrifice word could have been pretty confusing because it made it sound like it could fit in aristocrats decks, but exiling is much different because you don't get a death trigger. But yeah, it still could work with LTB effects. I think more than anything, this has a good ceiling in proliferate decks, once again, or in go wide decks that have sometimes just too many creatures than they actually have use for, or have, just things that are very disposable. I actually have a Council of 4 deck of mine that could use this. It builds up a ton of knights from its ability, but I'm Pillow Fort, so I'm not always attacking people. I'm just kind of staying there, minding my own business until I have like a big alpha strike. And I'm also always looking for more mana to be able to cast the cards that I'm drawing a ton of. So pretty cool card with a high ceiling of how much mana this land could potentially tap for in a single turn. We're now on our last card of the day, and that's Irrigation Ditch, which is played in 565 decks. This comes into play tapped. It taps for a white, or you can sacrifice it to add a green and a blue. This could be pretty nice in a deck that can recur lands from the graveyard that come into play tapped, or if you have a card, that makes lands come into play untapped. Also, if you need a Hail Mary play where you really need the 2 mana instead of the typical 1 mana that this does tap, having even just that option to sacrifice it and add 2 mana is pretty nice. Like I said, for being in only 500 decks, that's not as terrible of an ability as I would have thought. This is also part of a cycle. The other 3-color sack lands are Ancient Spring, which taps for blue or can sacrifice for white and black. Sulfur Vent, which can tap for black and sacrifice for blue and red. Geothermal Crevice, which taps for red and can sacrifice for black and green. And Tinder Farms, which tap for green and can sacrifice for red and white. All pretty unique and all very unloved, which is exactly why I love them. Alright, that was a hefty topic and a lot longer than we typically do on this channel, but I hope it was worth your time. If you stuck around this long, thanks so much for being here. Let me know what you thought, and if you do have any favorite unpopular lands that I didn't cover in this video. And don't forget to request a topic. I'll be sure to respond to your comment, and I'll pin a comment that will become the new video after 4 days of posting this. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.